The fluorescent lights at Mercy General hummed the same frequency as desperation. Sloane Whitfield had learned to recognize it after 7 years of night shifts in the ER. She was standing in the break room at 11:47 p.m., eating a granola bar that tasted like cardboard and pretending it was dinner, when her phone lit up with a notification from the bank. Overdraft warning. Again. She set the granola bar down and did the math in her head the same way she'd been doing it for months. Mortgage, Maya's tuition for kindergarten in the fall, the carburetor on the Civic that had been almost fixed for 6 weeks now. The numbers never added up the way she needed them to. 29 years old, an ER physician, and she was standing under fluorescent lights, eating a $1.49 granola bar for dinner because the hospital's parking garage had raised its monthly rate and she'd had to choose between that and groceries. She told herself it was fine. Told herself this was temporary. Told herself that next month, when the shift differential kicked in, things would balance out. She'd been telling herself that for 8 months. Her pager went off. She stuffed the rest of the granola bar in her mouth, grabbed her stethoscope, and went back to work. The encounter with Preston Ashby happened 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, which was the kind of ordinary detail that felt almost insulting in retrospect. Disasters should announce themselves. They shouldn't arrive on a Tuesday while you're picking up orange juice and pull-ups at the Harris Teeter 2 blocks from your apartment. Sloane had Maya on her hip, 4 years old, currently in the phase where she needed to touch every single item on every single shelf, and she was trying to navigate the dairy aisle without spending more than $40 total, which was the game she played every week. $40. Stretch it. She heard his voice before she saw him. Oh my God. Sloane? She turned. Preston Ashby stood at the end of the aisle, looking exactly the way she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the coat, some dark camel cashmere thing that probably cost more than her monthly car payment. He had that particular kind of confidence that came from never once having to worry about money, the kind that made a person stand differently, take up space differently, look at a grocery store like it was beneath them while still choosing to be in it. Beside him was a woman Sloane didn't recognize. Blonde, polished, the kind of effortlessly put together that took real effort and real money. She had her hand looped through Preston's arm, and she was looking at Sloane with the pleasant blankness of someone who'd never had reason to feel threatened by anything. "Preston," Sloane said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Maya had stopped reaching for the yogurt cups and was watching the strangers with the direct, unblinking suspicion of a 4-year-old. Wow, it's been, 2 years? Preston crossed the distance between them like he owned this aisle too, like he owned every aisle, every room, every space he walked into. "You look." His eyes moved over her. The scrubs she hadn't changed out of because she'd come straight from a 12-hour shift. Maya on her hip. The basket with the off-brand cereal and the generic orange juice and the bag of apples that were 3 for $5. Exactly the same. He said it like a diagnosis. "This is Courtney," Preston said, pulling the blonde woman forward. "My fiancée, Courtney, this is Sloane. We dated for about a year a while back. 2 years and 4 months, but a year worked too, she supposed." Courtney extended her hand. Her nails were done in the kind of pale pink that required weekly maintenance. "So sweet to meet you." She looked at Maya with a smile that was kind in the way that people were kind to strangers' children, briefly, from a safe distance. "And who is this?" "My daughter, Maya." Something shifted in Preston's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a puzzle piece confirming what he'd already suspected. "You have a daughter." He said it the way you'd say you ended up here, just like I thought. "I do. That's... wow. Good for you." He was quiet for a moment, which was somehow worse than him talking. "We just got back from Vail. Courtney's family has a place there, and we're doing the engagement party next month at the St. Regis. 500 people, can you imagine?" He laughed. "I keep telling Court it's too much, but you know how these things go." Sloane did not know how these things went. She had never been to anything at the St. Regis. She had declined the one time Preston had suggested it, back when they were together, because she'd been in her 2nd year of residency, and she couldn't afford the dress code, and she hadn't wanted to admit that. Preston glanced at Maya again, then back at Sloane. She looks like you, same stubbornness around the eyes. It didn't reach anything. No ring, though. I noticed. Didn't work out with her dad? There it was. Sloane felt something go quiet inside her. The particular stillness that comes right before a person decides to do something or not do something, right before they choose who they're going to be in this moment. She shifted Maya higher on her hip. No, she said simply. It didn't. That's too bad. Preston shook his head, making a face like he was genuinely sorry, which was the cruelest version of what he could have done. You always were stubborn about the wrong things. I used to tell you. You remember, I used to say, Sloane, you need to let people in. You need to stop holding the world at arm's length. He spread his hands. I guess some things don't change. Courtney made a small, uncomfortable sound. Even she could tell this had veered somewhere it shouldn't. Preston, I'm just saying. He looked at Sloane with something she recognized now as pity, which he'd always wielded like a scalpel. You're smart, Sloane. You were always smart. But smart doesn't keep you warm at night. It doesn't sit across from you at dinner. And it doesn't. His eyes landed on Maya with practiced subtlety. It doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. Maya looked at Preston with her mother's steady eyes and said, very clearly, you're not nice. Preston blinked. Sloane almost smiled. We should get going, Courtney said firmly, tugging at Preston's arm. It was so lovely to meet you, Sloane. They moved past her down the aisle. Preston's cashmere coat brushing the shelf as he went, Courtney's heels clicking against the linoleum. Sloane stood still for a moment. Then she put the off-brand orange juice in her basket and moved to the next aisle. That man was rude, Maya informed her. Yeah, baby, he was. Are you okay, Mama? Sloane pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. I'm always okay. It wasn't exactly a lie. It was the version of things she needed to believe right now in the Harris Teeter dairy aisle with $40 and rent due on Friday. She was always okay. She was always managing. She just hadn't figured out yet that there was a difference between managing and living. She met Damian Cole 6 days later in the worst possible way, which is to say in the way that real things happen, without warning, without elegance, in the middle of a crisis that had nothing to do with him. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday, and Maya had a fever of 104.1, and Sloane's car was making a sound it absolutely should not have been making, somewhere between a grinding and a wheeze that her carburetor expert neighbor had warned her about for weeks. She was 3 blocks from the hospital, Maya bundled in the back seat, when the Civic shuddered and died at a red light. Sloane sat there for exactly 3 seconds, hands on the wheel, assessing. No emergency flashers. The fuse had been out for a month, and she hadn't replaced it yet. Late enough that the street was nearly empty. Close enough to walk, except Maya was burning up, and the temperature outside was 42 degrees. She got out of the car, put her hazards on manually by leaving the door open. Went around to unbuckle Maya. The car stopped, Maya said gravely. The car stopped, Sloane agreed. She lifted her daughter, pressed her palm to her forehead, still burning, and pulled her close. We're going to walk, okay? It's not far. Is the car broken? Yes. Like how broken? Very, very broken. A black car pulled up behind her. She tensed, the automatic tension of a woman alone at 2 a.m. with a sick child and a dead car. The calculation happening faster than thought. Distance to the hospital. Distance to the nearest lit building. Visibility. The window came down. The man inside was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something threatening, probably, her nervous system already primed. What she got was a man in his late 30s, dark suit, looking at her with an expression that was not pity and was not aggression, but was something more useful than either. Assessment. The same expression she probably wore in a trauma bay, looking at a situation and cataloging what it needed. Your car? He said. Dead. Where are you going? She nodded down the street. Mercy General. 3 blocks, he looked at Maya. At the way the child's head was heavy against Sloane's shoulder, the flush visible even in the poor street lighting. He didn't say get in the way that was a command. He said it in the way that was simply the obvious next step. I'll drive you. I don't. She started to refuse out of habit, out of the deeply ingrained reflex of a woman who'd spent years not accepting help from anyone because accepting help meant owing something. 3 blocks, the man said. Your daughter's sick. Sloane looked at Maya, looked at the 42 degrees, looked at the 3 blocks. She got in the car. He drove them to the hospital without asking questions. When they pulled up to the ER entrance, he got out first and opened her door, not in the way someone does it to perform something, but in the way someone does it because it's the most efficient way to let her get out with a child in her arms. He held the door. That was all. Thank you, Sloane said. He looked at her for a moment. She'll be okay. It was such a specific, certain thing to say to a stranger. Not I hope so or good luck. Just a quiet declaration, like a fact. She almost asked how he could possibly know that. Instead, she carried Maya through the ER doors, and when she turned around to look back through the glass, the black car was already gone. She didn't think about it again. She had a sick child and an overnight shift starting 6 hours and a dead car to deal with. She didn't have the bandwidth for strangers in black sedans who said things with certainty they couldn't possibly possess. Except she did think about it again. Later, at 4 a.m., sitting in the chair next to Maya's pediatric bed while her daughter slept and her fever broke and the monitors beeped softly. She thought about it, about the way he'd looked at her, not like Preston had looked at her, cataloging and finding insufficient, like something else entirely, like he was trying to memorize the coordinates of something important. She told herself she was sleep-deprived and projecting. She probably was. His name was Damien Cole, and she learned this 9 days later when he walked into the ER with a laceration across his left forearm that needed 8 stitches and the particular calm of a man for whom pain was an inconvenience rather than a revelation. She recognized him immediately. He didn't seem surprised to see her, which she filed away. You, she said. Me, he agreed. She cleaned the wound with the same efficiency she brought to everything. He didn't flinch. The laceration was clean, precise, not an accident, she thought, and then told herself that was none of her business. How's your daughter? He asked. She looked up. She's fine. How did you? I didn't tell you her name. You didn't. He wasn't apologetic about this. I asked about the case at the registration desk, the night you came in. Sloane kept her expression neutral while she threaded the needle. That's a significant overstep. Yes, most people would apologize for that. I wanted to know if she was all right. She finished the 2nd stitch. The 3rd, he had a small scar on his wrist, old and faded, that she'd seen before on people who'd spent time in places that left marks. She didn't ask about it. I'm Damien, he said. I know. You gave your name at registration. A beat, and you're Dr. Whitfield. You read my ID badge. You have an excellent memory for detail, he said. So do I. She tied off the last stitch with more precision than strictly necessary. You should keep it dry for 48 hours. Come back in 10 days to have them removed or go to your GP. I don't have a GP. Everyone should have a GP. I'll add it to the list. He looked at her directly. He had the kind of eyes that were difficult to look at for very long, not because they were unkind, but because they were very, very attentive. Can I buy you coffee? Not tonight. Whenever works for you. I don't date patients. I'm not a patient. I'm a person who needed 8 stitches and who you will never see in a clinical capacity again. That's a technicality. I specialize in technicalities. She looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights always did, made everyone look slightly exhausted, slightly wan. He looked like he'd been born in fluorescent light and found it irrelevant. I have a daughter, she said, not as a warning, as information. A shorthand way of saying, my life is complicated and built for exactly one person's priorities, and those priorities are small and 4 years old and have a stuffed elephant named Gerald. I know, he said. That doesn't give most men pause in a flattering way. I'm not most men. She didn't know why she believed him. Maybe it was 3 a.m. and she was too tired to maintain appropriate skepticism. Maybe it was the 8 stitches and the way he'd sat through them without drama. Maybe it was the way he'd said she'll be okay in that parking lot at 2 a.m. like it was simply true. 1 coffee, she said. Daytime, public place. I'll take it. 1 coffee became 3. 3 became a pattern neither of them named, because naming things had consequences, and they were both people who understood consequences. Damien was quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they chose carefully. He asked about her work with the kind of interest that wasn't performance. He remembered things. He noticed things. When she mentioned once that Maya had a thing about the texture of certain socks, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just nodded like it was useful information he was cataloging for later. She learned almost nothing about him. This should have alarmed her more than it did. She knew he had money, the kind of money that had existed long enough to be invisible. No performance of it, just the texture of a life where things were simply taken care of. She knew he had people around him, not friends exactly, more like a structure, a system of presences. She knew he operated in the kind of space that city newspapers mentioned in brief paragraphs they didn't fully commit to. She told herself she was a grown woman and a physician, and she knew how to assess risk. She told herself that right up until the Tuesday night, she'd agreed to let him pick her up from a late shift. Her car still in the shop, Maya at her neighbor Deborah's, and instead of his usual black sedan, there was a different car with a different driver and a note that said simply, "Something came up. Car is yours. Tell Ramirez where you're going." Ramirez turned out to be the driver's name. He was polite and said nothing, and when Sloane gave her address, he drove there without incident and waited until she was inside her building before pulling away. It was the most cared for she'd felt in 3 years. That was the problem. She was falling for someone she didn't fully know, which was terrifying under any circumstances. And whatever Damian Cole was, whatever the edges of his life looked like, the parts he kept peripheral, the parts she'd noticed but not asked about, those edges were not the edges of a simple man. She knew this. She was falling anyway. 3 weeks later, she met his world. It happened at the hospital, which was fitting, because most of the worst and best things in Sloane's life had happened there. She was finishing a consult in the 4th floor corridor when she heard the commotion near the elevator. Voices, too many of them, and the particular cadence of men trying to speak quietly but failing at it. She turned the corner and found Damian standing in the hallway with 2 men she'd never seen and a doctor she recognized, Kaufman, from the cardiac unit, and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not on him. On him she'd seen calm, warmth, precision. This was something else. Controlled, yes, but underneath the control was something with weight to it, something that took up space differently than anything she'd seen from him before. He saw her. The expression shifted, briefly. "Sloane." He crossed to her. "I'm sorry. I should have told you I was here. What's happening?" He glanced back at the 2 men, who had the specific stillness of people trained not to move unnecessarily. "My brother's in cardiac. It's not. He's stable. But I got the call an hour ago, and He stopped. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." She put her hand on his arm. "Damian." He looked at her. "I work here," she said. "Let me help." Something crossed his face, something that looked like relief and terrified him at the same time, like a man who had built his entire existence around not needing anyone, discovering a fault line. Later, after she'd talked to Kaufman, after she'd translated the medical into something human and navigable, after the 2 silent men had finally been persuaded to go get coffee, she sat with Damian in the family waiting area, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There are things about my life you don't know. I'm aware." He looked at her. "Things that aren't simple? Damian? Sloane? I have a 4-year-old who carries a stuffed elephant everywhere and cried for 45 minutes last week because her toast was the wrong shade of brown." She looked at him steadily. "I am familiar with things that aren't simple." He almost smiled. It changed his whole face. "My family has a particular kind of business," he said carefully. "The kind that isn't discussed in polite company. The kind that—" He paused. "I got out, mostly. But getting out is its own complicated thing, and the people who don't want you out make that very clear sometimes." She processed this. The car, the men, the way certain conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the small, deliberate silences around anything that touched on what he did exactly when he wasn't sitting across from her in a coffee shop asking about her week. "Are you safe?" she asked. "Yes." "Is Maya safe? If she's around you, is she?" "Yes." His voice was absolute. "I would not allow anything near her. Or you. I need you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. The waiting room hummed around them, the quiet distress of families in uncertain situations, the particular light that hospitals reserved for spaces where hard things happened. "I know," she said. She did know. She didn't know how she knew, exactly, but she did. The same way she knew a patient was going to be okay before the numbers confirmed it, some convergence of evidence that added up to certainty before she could fully articulate the math. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "You're telling me now." He looked at her hands. She had a doctor's hands, practical, unmanicured, slightly dry from the constant glove-on glove-off of hospital work. He looked at them like they were remarkable. "I don't know what I'm doing with you," he said quietly. "I know that's not a flattering thing to say. But I don't usually do this. I don't bring people into my life who I'm not." He stopped. "I don't have people I can't afford to lose." She understood this. She understood it in the specific way of someone who'd spent 3 years building walls careful enough to protect a small child from any more uncertainty, any more disruption, any more proof that the people who said they'd stay were often just saying it. "What are you saying?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm saying I can't afford to lose you, and I haven't figured out what to do about that yet." Outside the window, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent, enormous, continuing. Sloane sat in the family waiting area of the hospital where she'd spent half her adult life and thought about $40, and the granola bar and Preston Ashby's voice saying, "Smart doesn't keep you warm at night." "Your brother's going to be okay," she said. "The arrhythmia is manageable, Kaufman is excellent, and they caught it early." Damien exhaled. "As for the other thing," she met his eyes. "We figure it out. Together. That's what people do." He was quiet for a moment. "You make it sound straightforward." "Nothing about this is straightforward." She almost smiled. "But I'm an ER doctor. I work in conditions of incomplete information all the time." His hand covered hers on the armrest. Not a gesture, just a fact. Just weight and warmth and presence. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. She ran into Preston again 6 weeks later. She hadn't been looking for him, and she hadn't been avoiding him. He just arrived, the way he always had, at the center of his own story. It was at the Benefit for Mercy General's pediatric wing, one of those obligatory fundraising evenings that came with territory of being a physician in a mid-sized city. Sloane was in the black dress she'd had for 4 years, and the heels she only wore to things like this. And she was carrying a glass of water because the bar was crowded, and she was on call at 8 a.m., and she was mostly thinking about getting home to Maya. She felt him before she saw him. That specific awareness she'd carried for 2 years that had slowly faded and recently disappeared entirely, replaced by a different awareness, a better one, and then there he was across the room, already looking. He made his way over. Courtney was with him, the diamond catching the chandelier light, the way it had caught the grocery store fluorescence 6 weeks ago. Sloane. He looked genuinely pleased, which was always how the most uncomfortable moments started with Preston. "What are you doing here?" "I work here," she said. "I'm on staff." Right. He glanced around the room with the specific approval of a man who needed to endorse the spaces he entered. "Nice event. We do a lot of charitable work. Court's family is very involved in the community." He looked at Sloane, and she could see him doing the same calculation he'd been doing in the grocery store. Cataloging, assessing. "You look good, actually. Different." She didn't say anything. "No little one tonight?" "She's with her aunt, and still no." He glanced at her left hand. "Preston." Courtney's voice was gentle but firm. She'd clearly had some version of this conversation with him before about appropriate and not appropriate. "I'm just asking." Sloane felt, rather than heard, the shift behind her, the air pressure change of someone moving to her side. She knew it before she turned. She knew it the way you know the particular weight of someone's presence when it's become familiar. Damien settled beside her. He had a drink he wasn't particularly interested in, and the calm of a man who had walked into many rooms in his life and assessed all of them correctly. He looked at Preston. Preston looked at him. Something happened in Preston's face that Sloane had never seen there before. A recalibration. Preston was very good at reading rooms. It was how he operated. It was his particular skill, and he was reading this room now and arriving somewhere uncomfortable. "This is Damien," Sloane said simply. Preston extended his hand. "Preston Ashby." The name came out like a credential. I'm an old friend of Sloane's. I know who you are, Damien said pleasantly. He shook the hand briefly. The Ashby Group, commercial real estate. You have a piece of the new development on Morrison Street. Preston blinked. That's right. The zoning variance came through last spring. Damien said this the way you say things you know, because knowing things is what you do. Congratulations. Preston was quiet for a moment, recalibrating again. You're in business? Damien smiled. It was a precise smile, calibrated with the same care he brought to everything. Among other things, he put his hand at the small of Sloane's back. Not possessive, just present, just the fact of him. Preston looked at the hand, looked at Damien, looked at Sloane. Well, he said, you look well, Sloane. I mean it. He paused. Both of you. It was good to see you. They moved to Preston and his fiancée and his cashmere and his 500 guests, and Sloane stood with Damien in the middle of a charity benefit at the hospital where she'd worked for 7 years, and she felt something settle in her chest. The way a patient's blood pressure finally settles after the right intervention. Not dramatic, just correct. That was him, Damien said. Not a question. Yes, he's not as impressive as he thinks he is, she laughed, genuinely. The laugh surprised her. No, he's really not. Damien looked at her for a moment. For what it's worth, I know what you're worth. I've known it since a parking lot at 2 a.m. when you were 3 blocks from your destination and you didn't ask for help until the last possible second. That's a very specific thing to notice. I notice specific things. His hand was still at her back. You were protecting her, even then, even exhausted and alone in the middle of the night. You were still putting yourself between her and the problem. Sloane looked at him. That's just parenting. No, he said. That's you. She looked at him for a long time, this man with his careful words and his complicated edges and his brother, who was stable now, recovering in a hospital room 3 floors up, and the weight of his hand at her back like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Maya asked about you last night, she said. His expression shifted, the softest shift. What did she say? She asked if Damien was going to come to her birthday party. Sloane kept her voice even. She's turning 5 in March. The theme is, currently, dinosaurs. It changes every week. Tell her yes, he said. Quietly. Certainly. Tell her I'll be there. She nodded. Outside the tall windows of the hospital's event space, the city lights moved in their usual patterns, indifferent and enormous and continuing. And Sloane thought about who she'd been 6 weeks ago in the Harris Teeter dairy aisle, $40, and an overdue mortgage, and a man who'd looked at her like a case study in something that hadn't worked out. She thought about who she was standing here. Same woman. Same scrappy, tired, fiercely competent woman who'd been counting out options since she was 22 years old. Just finally, not alone in it. The fluorescent lights, the flat tire, the man who'd stopped when he shouldn't have. She hadn't known then what they were. She'd been too exhausted and too practical and too determined not to need anything. She knew now. Some choices looked like accidents. Some accidents were the best decision you ever made. And some strangers, the ones who showed up at 2 a.m. and said, she'll be okay with a certainty they had no right to possess. Some strangers were the beginning of everything. Maya would ask her later, when she was old enough for the whole story, whether she'd been scared, whether she'd known in that parking lot that her life was about to change. Sloane would tell her the truth. She'd been terrified and exhausted and holding on by the thinnest thread. And no, she hadn't known anything except that her daughter needed to get to the hospital and there was a man in a car who looked at her like she was a fact worth noting. But sometimes she would tell Maya, that's enough. Sometimes not running away is the bravest and most important thing you can do. And sometimes the most terrifying door is the one that opens into exactly the life you were supposed to have. The one you never would have dreamed for yourself because you were too busy surviving to imagine anything beyond it. Then she would kiss her daughter on the forehead, the same daughter who had once, in a Harris Teeter dairy aisle, looked at a man in a cashmere coat and said, "You're not nice," with the precision of someone who had always been very clear about what things were. And Sloane would think, she learned that from me. The clarity, the refusal to pretend. She would decide that was enough. She would decide that was more than enough. That was everything.